Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today, my guest is Giff Lasta. Well, Giff Lasta, who is a marriage coach for men and Twitter personality. And thank you for doing this. What's the derivation of the last name Lasta?
Oh, now, Dean, that's my real last name.
I know, but where does it come from?
It is Croatian, actually.
Croatian.
It means
Okay.
swallow, I believe. It featured heavily in Michael O'Brien's novel Island of the World.
Okay, great. So it's Croatian. So, if your last name had been McGrady, I would have had a good sense of where that came from. But Lasta is a little more unusual.
Right.
So, thanks for doing this.
Absolutely. Glad to be on here.
Tell us a little bit about how you got started with what you're doing and why the questions of marriage and intersexual relationships, why are those so important to you personally?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, kind of in some ways a wild story, some ways a pretty normal story. I was married for 15 years, grew up in the church, very serious Christian. We were actually on the mission field doing cross-cultural ministry in Asia. Lived over there with my family of four kids for 7 years. So that was pretty tough. We were in a very dense, packed, polluted city with not necessarily a particularly friendly posture from the authorities and everything else. And over time, that really pushed our marriage to the brink as far as just stress was concerned. And throughout all that, I had a porn addiction, like pretty much most every other Christian guy I knew.
When you say that your marriage was pushed to the brink by the stress, like what does the brink look like?
I think just where things were breaking down mental health wise, like just of our endurance to kind of continue to push ahead in the environment we were in. And so,
but does that mean you're like yelling at each other all the time? Does it mean you weren't talking? What does that in practical terms?
I think mostly it meant that both of us just, falling into some depression, little things becoming big things. Just our ability to handle life was really going down.
Okay. Yes, and you had a porn addiction.
Yeah, well, and really, looking back over it, it's the kind of thing where that, enables a lot of poor status quo, because and I didn't see it at the time, but it was very much I could go into these fantasies where, I am, the king with his harem and all is right with the world. I'm on the top of I've hit the genetic jackpot. I've won the game of life. And that wasn't the case. My family was struggling. We were struggling. We needed real engagement, strong decisions, all those things that I wasn't providing. And my wife was kind of run ragged.
And so the porn at that point was kind of a way of escaping reality.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And sapping my motivation, I would say.
Sure. Right.
So
both a fantasy that allows you to escape reality, a fantasy that makes reality less satisfying, and also reduces your capacity for dealing with that reality.
Yeah, really not good. It's
right.
But at the time, it feels completely unrelated to everything else in your life. Because it sort of enables the status quo in a sense that you feel like, okay, I can handle the status quo. And
I've
got this little vice, but It doesn't impact anything else.
About how old were you at that point?
Let's see. I would have been right around the time we came back. I would have been mid to late 30s.
Hmm. It takes a while in life to begin to see how all of the pieces relate to one another, no matter who you are, no matter what the pieces are. Right? I think there's part of us that just tends to, especially maybe as men, tend to just compartmentalize things and believe that and not see the connections necessarily.
Yes. Yeah, well, I guess so. I mean, I certainly would prefer in retrospect, it's like, oh, if I had known, I would have done it right. If I could do it again, I could do it
Sure.
right. But I
Right.
suppose maybe that's not the most mature way of looking at the scope of our lives.
But part of why men need a coach is to help them see how the disparate what they think are the disparate parts of their lives are actually connected.
Hmm. Yeah.
So you came back, and what happened? How did
Well,
you come back?
there was, yeah, we talk about being pushed to the brink. It was at the point where we were going to have to move to a different city. And we didn't have the energy to really push ahead and go on and like do this all again, meet a whole new friend group, try to manage all the international living and everything else to set up again. Anyway, it was, yeah, we were particularly my wife was pushed as far as she could be pushed. And so we came home and we were kind of licking our wounds. We were disillusioned with our faith. Our home church, very grateful to them because they kind of gave us space to do that. To just kind of sit in the liturgy, let it do its work. But around that time, it was when my wife confronted me, and there was some indication, she saw some signs that I'd been doing this, some like old email account that got something forwarded, and
Oh, wait,
she,
so she had no clue about your addiction up to that point.
oh no, she certainly did. She certainly
Okay.
did, but it wasn't a present reality. It was something I acknowledged, something I said I'm working
Mm.
on. Um, and I think she wanted to believe that I'm working on it meant that I had fixed it.
Hmm.
Um, and it was that kind of uneasy thing. I was pretty open, or I considered myself pretty open, but then I wasn't going out of my way to engage in conversations about that.
Full and complete truth about these things.
Right. Right. And so there was a certain thing where she confronted me, and she referred to some friends of ours who were having a real bottom moment with
Mm.
some infidelity, and she said, can this please right now, could this please right now be our rock bottom? Can this be as far as we go down, and
Good for her.
we get up from there? Yeah, I mean, I was stone cold. Because I didn't see any, I mean, I've been fighting this thing for like 25 years. I've given every bit of resource that I knew to throw at it. I availed myself of all the resources in the church and everything else, and nothing worked. And
How
so,
come? Why did nothing
um,
work?
why did nothing work? My opinion is because it didn't address the real problem.
Hmm.
It was trying to address something that was downstream from something else.
What was the real problem?
Real problem had to do with masculinity and manhood. Um, and a man sort of taking ownership of his life, and including his sexuality, and integrating that, affirming it and integrating it into his goals and into his other drives. And I didn't have any guidance on that. I didn't even have a schema with that. It was instead treated as, oh, this is this sin, this vice, there's this problem of your heart. Your heart isn't really devoted to God. I'm like, I've devoted every bit of my heart to God, and it's still here. But
Hmm.
that was the framework. Those were the tools that people had. Well, just get some accountability, um, and try to stop doing this thing, and know that
Hmm.
God
So
loves
what
you
did you
anyway.
do? So what did you do?
Well, I had, it sat with me, and I was sort of cold, but her words kind of, sat with me for a little while, and I thought, you know what? I remember reading, I think it may have been The Art of Manliness or something that referred to this no fap movement, and it's like there's this secular porn recovery movement, and shoot, that sounds good to me right now because I'm a little disillusioned with my faith anyway. Where else can I go, Lord? But yeah,
Mhm.
I don't want to be burned anymore. Um, and so
Let me ask you a question. Let's stop. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it occurs to me, and this might be the right place to ask. Are you saying that the way that the your Christian community and maybe the evangelical community at large framed pornography use and addiction and the way they understood it to work and therefore the resources that they offered to help you change, are you saying that those things actually perpetuated the problem and made it worse instead of better? That you might have been free of it earlier had you had this more secular approach?
I, if I'm comparing the Christian approach to the secular approach, the Christian approach I got to a purely secular approach that I found, I'd say the secular approach was better.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Work.
it is true that Mark Queppet, who was the guy who ended up coaching me, who is actually a Catholic, but he has his own story around that. But at the time, he was focused in a purely secular context. And
Right.
he found in practice in his coaching clients that secular guys who come to him to get help to quit porn have an easier time of it and are more successful than the religious guys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So and we've got some various theories around that, but yeah, it's unfortunate.
I'd like to hear those theories, but I don't want to derail too much from your story. So you remembered hearing about this other approach and you did what? Googled it?
Yeah, basically, I Googled it, got involved, saw that there was this kind of a clear goal with this 90-day sexual fast.
Mm.
And it was actually kind of interesting because I remember really admiring there was a book I read, Kristen Lavran's daughter. It's right up there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a guy in it, Lavrans, who is like the epitome of like a medieval, great man in Norway. And one of the things they would do for Lent every year is they would abstain from sex. It was just what you did if you were a pious person at that time. And I was like, gosh, going 45 days. And then it was like, this thing is 90 days, this full sexual fast, no sexual release at all, no masturbation, no sex with your wife. And it was very intimidating and challenging. It's like, dude, that's twice what Lavrans would have done. And it's like, is this even possible? And then I got involved with Mark Queppett's coaching, and I went straight to day 90. I'd never done that before in my
Mm.
life, but I was very, very engaged, and I was just devouring the content, learning about how masculine sexuality works, all these forces that have been operating on me. I was learning how they worked, and it was so ridiculously empowering.
What were the two or three big things that you learned?
Um, I think the connection of masculine sexuality with status was huge. That
What tell us what that is?
that you when you're we think of this as, or at least I thought of this as just a straightforward itch, right? I'm itching, so I need to scratch it, and then I feel better.
Mm.
But the idea that actually the circuitry in our brains around status, like how am I doing relative to my goals? How am I doing relative to other things in my life? That's not like a high level prefrontal cortex kind of thing. That's lizard brain stuff. That's, Jordan Peterson
Mm.
talks about the lobsters, right? That is as fundamental or almost as fundamental as sexual circuitry, and it immediately plays into it because of the way women are wired to want to find a man of higher standing across some hierarchy, whether it's looks or appearance or money or confidence or whatever,
Sure.
that you pushing yourself in a status game, um, that is what your sexuality is meant to be channeled into. And so what that ends up meaning is that you don't think about it. You just think about it when you're an addict. You just think like, oh, I'm horny. But if you say, wait a second, what if you can't jerk off? What if you can't, get relief? How do you feel? It's like, well, I'm really antsy because this thing at work and this thing at, this thing's not going well. And all of a sudden these emotions that you're pushing down about how your status in your life is being rattled come to the surface. So,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, that sounds, guys don't believe it when you say stuff like that because that sounds woo woo or, over psychologized, psychoanalyzed. But our drive for status is like right intertwined with our sexuality.
Well, it seems to me what you're talking about is really a drive for a kind of fulfillment. And that because people aren't fulfilled by status that means nothing to them, right? It's really the only reason you want to achieve a goal is so that you experience the fulfillment that you associate with it.
Right.
And that there's also a kind of sexual fulfillment, and so that the use of pornography, etc., is, I guess, well, this is probably where you're going, a short circuiting of that process of creating fulfillment for yourself across the spectrum of your life circumstances.
Yeah, I would say that, but I would like the term status isn't a bad one. Now people tend to think of it in a shallow way, but if you
Mhm.
think status as, you're using the term fulfillment, if you think of it as across any goal, across anything that you value, how are you doing relative to where you want to be?
Mhm.
At that point, that's a much broader thing than just say social standing, right? It's my fitness, my faith, whether my character, all of those things. I'm measuring myself against where I want to be, and and then where does that go into sexuality? Well, the idea that the king with his harem, right? He's the highest on every hierarchy in the land. And so what does that mean? It means he's the most sexually attractive to all of these women. He can attract huge amounts of people and he's going to propagate his genes, right? So there's this with masculine sexuality, there's a relationship to how much we throw ourselves into the goals that we're pursuing and then women looking and saying, "Ooh, that's someone who knows what he's about. That's someone attractive to me." So,
Mhm.
and so what you're simulating in pornography is something that nobody but the King Solomons and the Genghis Khans had in the past. And that's to be like, oh, tonight, I think I'd like you and you and you and not you. Oh, maybe you, right? And nobody could do that except those, once in a million men who were on top of the world. And yet we're simulating what it feels like to be that. And
Without
so
actually achieving anything.
what? Yeah,
Without
without
actually.
without achieving it, right? So we're telling our mind that we're the conqueror of the world, and actually you're conquering nothing.
So, what was the practical effect of learning all this on you and your marriage and that kind of thing? How
I
what did that change?
a drive to a drive to improve and to learn how to push myself forward on a lot of fronts. I mean, physical fitness was a huge thing. Yeah, that's a huge thing where you can put your sexual energy into just pushing yourself. And then I think also the other thing that I really got through this content is realizing that my sexual drive wasn't the enemy. That even sort of, aggressive sexual desires and just really wanting to put myself out there and go after what I wanted, that's not a bad thing. That's
Mhm.
not something I need to like try to fight and stuff down. It's something I need to integrate and direct.
Mhm.
And that I think especially is where the approach I got in the evangelical church is kind of a fool's errand, where you're trying to fight something that is put in us for a reason, and is I mean, it's a horse meant to be broken in the sense that you build trust with it and ride it, not something to just be beaten every time it shows a little bit of energy.
Mhm. Mhm. And so things are where do things stand for you today?
Well, we're 7 years away from that, and
Mhm.
basically, quitting porn and that journey was a journey. I mean, my Mark Weppett calls it the rite of passage of the modern man. And that's
Mm.
absolutely what it was for me. I felt like I was going from being a boy to being a man. And it was the start of a journey to where I said, okay, like, time to be a man now, even after everything that I had been through. Um, and I think the big thing that I kind of expected, okay, I've quit porn, I've been a good boy. Like,
Mhm.
so I should get great sex now, right? Like I should get all this sexual fulfillment in my marriage. It's my right. I've earned it.
Mhm.
Um, Not how it works. And now I didn't have this like outlet, this like soothing coping mechanism anymore. So I had to feel my own pain. And a lot of that was the pain that my marriage was not in good shape.
Mhm.
And so,
It's so
really,
fascinating. Like you can't even begin to repair the relationship until you are become the kind of person who can do the repair.
absolutely,
I guess the
absolutely.
metaphor is your house is falling apart, but before you can repair it, you need to go to carpentry school.
Right.
And so it's easy to think, well, I just graduated from carpentry school. My house should somehow be magically fixed.
Yeah, absolutely not. And the thing with that in the case of, sexuality and marriage is that and I think we're talking about like the various evangelical approaches. A lot of evangelical curriculum around this takes the perspective of, well, Jesus said porn is adultery. And so,
Mhm.
therefore, we need to look at this like a relationship that needs to recover trust after an affair. And so,
Mm.
the whole process is dictated by her trauma and trying to soothe her trauma. And I really actually appreciated this about my wife is that she said, I do not feel like you have had an affair. What I feel like, and this is what she said after I had actually put in some reps and started improving myself as a man. She said, what I feel is anger that you could be like this. This is possible for you to be like this. And you gave me 15 years of that. You
Mhm.
gave me 15 years of life with another boy instead of alongside a man. And I want a refund. Like
I think it's
that.
worth saying the for the record that there are women who feel when they discover a porn habit and their husband's porn habit, they do feel that they've been betrayed sexually as they would with an affair, and that if that's the case, that's fine. There are ways to move forward with that, but
I
but
would say, I would
I don't
say,
want to
Dean,
invalidate that.
I would say there are ways to move forward with that, but not, but if this is an addiction he has had since puberty, if
Mhm.
this isn't something, where he's been porn free, but then he then made a conscious choice later in life to indulge in a new vice. If this has been something throughout his entire life, then you're not going to improve things by trying to add to this problem that he has never solved extra guilt and responsibility for her trauma. Like
Well,
what he needs is he needs to become a man first, like that whole
sure.
carpentry thing. Once he has built himself up to where he has control over his own self, then he has the capacity to start, just taking on her trauma. And
Sure. Right. Yes, I think that there has to be a an order of progression,
yeah.
but that doesn't mean that but I just don't want to say that women who do have those feelings that's invalid. That
No,
if
and well, and
right,
feelings are never,
right, right.
if you're going to display good emotional leadership in your home as a man, you never discount
Tell
her
us
feelings.
now about right. So that's a good segue. Tell us now about what you have to say about good relational leadership in your family as a man
Mm.
with the men you work with. So kind of transitioning a little bit to that.
Yeah, I'd say, I've kind of stumbled in the trenches, going through this process, focusing really as my kind of ground truth measurement as women's sexuality. Women's sexuality is responsive. Their libido is in no small part a response to how their husbands approach them as men. And so what you find is this glorious bit of real truth, ground truth to optimize against. And it ends up being a fantastic barometer for the overall health of the relationship and how the man is approaching her as a man, particularly around leadership. And I found in that almost like, I don't know, I feel like I've discovered something very rare and new, because on the one hand, you have the general culture that's denying any sort of like masculine leadership as being a good thing in
Right.
marriage, and then you have various Christian, more like conservative patriarchal groups that affirm this, but they affirm it in sort of letter, like where you're just obey the rule. Oh, you be like a good husband, a strong husband, and you submit to him. And they're just reading a playbook, but they're not seeing the reality that's supposed to be built, that those playbooks were meant to adhere to, I guess, to affirm, I guess.
It's interesting. I don't know if you heard, I did an episode with Christiana Miller a while back, and we discussed the question of the patriarchy. And I said that the patriarchy is really just the reality that men will always be the socially dominant sex in every society. That's all it is. And when you accept that is a reality, you can see exactly the sides you're laying out, who neither of whom have a complex and honest enough approach to reality to be able to deal with that in a nuanced way. So on one hand, you have the left, you have the sort of the liberal feminist approach that says all patriarchy is bad and we should smash it and everybody should hate it and it's awful and it's terrible and it damages people. And they cannot account for the fact that for many women, there are many appealing things about a patriarchal underlying. Part of the reason that the patriarchy can't be smashed is that there are things about it that many women like. And the left, liberal feminism, in its simplistic approach, tends to try to present to us a narrative that says that's never true, that no woman ever likes the patriarchy, and if she thinks she does, it's internalized misogyny. Now, on the other hand, you have the people you're talking about, sort of the neo-patriarchalists or whatever, who really are just hate women. They really just hate femininity. They hate the way that women's minds work, et cetera. And neither of these are honest agendas, I don't think.
Well, I'd want to, for the other poll, it'd probably be better to choose more like, I don't know, more, maybe a softer, bigger evangelical tent, right? With how we've approached leadership in evangelical circles. Like the man is supposed to be the spiritual head of the household, and wives should submit to their husbands, but pretty soft about it. That was pretty standard. But my problem there, and that's more what I grew up in, my problem with that is they never told you how to do it. They never gave you any brass tacks about like, okay, what does it actually mean? Besides, well, if you're the man, you should probably be leading family prayer.
Right.
And beyond that, and that was what was beautiful about, learning, using sexuality as sort of the key in here, is that there is a female body agenda that responds to being led well, but will resist being led badly. And that leadership has to be congruent and present through all of life, because you can't just show up one way in the bedroom and another way, for the rest of the evening. It won't be congruent and she will not accept it. And so you're kind of reading the book of nature when you're trying to get our body chemistry working well.
It's very interesting, too, when you talk about she won't accept it. This is the other thing that both of these sides in our current culture tend to miss about intersexual dynamics, is that you can have leadership and submission, but there's a sense in which her submission is always consensual. And if she doesn't really consent, it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
And so in a way, as a leader, what you're trying to do is not impose anything on her, but rather to inspire her
Right.
consent.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's a lot of guys like have been like so browbeaten by the word consent, right? Where they feel like that means that they have to ask specific permission about every little thing they do, which is not the subtlety of communication that works in a marriage, but it's more of the consent of her like deep heart, her
Right.
deep drives, and like I think that's one important thing I learned in this idea is the whole idea of a woman's body agenda as opposed to her mind. That you think, okay, well, honey, if I do X, Y, and Z, will you then be aroused and attracted to me and we can have great sex? And her mind can say yes, but you're not negotiating with the party that actually like has power over this. And so it's more of like, how am I courting, her, the part of her that she doesn't have control over. Um, and that's what good masculinity does.
All right, there's so much here, and we don't have time to explore everything. So let's focus a couple things. So I invited you on after I had written a tweet about frame, the
Mm,
concept of frame, which, as you know, when you start to research these matters, that comes up very quickly. And it is difficult for people to define. If you read online, you'll see many different definitions of masculine frame. And everyone knows it's really important, but I think it's hard for people to nail down. So I
yeah,
wanted to talk a little bit about that, and then let's talk brass tacks before we wrap up.
sure. Sounds
All
great.
right. So what do you think about the frame debate?
I don't know if, uh, yeah, I don't know if debate is quite the right word. It's just people try to explain it, and yeah, different people go to different levels of depth on it. But
Mm.
fundamentally, if I were to say, what most people are talking about is, a man who has standards and boundaries and can can basically is operating out of his goals.
Mhm.
And so he's basically that as far as he's concerned, he's in control in the situation.
Yes, Mark Queppet, on whom you've mentioned a couple times on Twitter, I think responded to that discussion and said, "Frame is the question of whose desires are controlling the man's actions. Are they his? Are they, I suppose, his wife's? I suppose they could be his church or his parents, whoever. Right?
Right.
But it has. He's saying it has to do with how much a man acts on his own inner initiative and desire. And I think that is foundational. But here's why I think that concept needs to be fleshed out more. Is that it's hard for me to think of the concept of frame outside the concept of containment, and so that we have the masculine containing the feminine, in the sense that the masculine sort of builds a protective wall around the feminine so the feminine can flourish. And that frame then has to be more, it has to have brass tacks to it in a way, because it's got to be the way I often, when guys ask me about it, I say it's the story the man is telling with his life.
Mm.
And so that it's the thing into which he could invite a woman. And if you're and you have strong frame and you have weak frame. And so King Solomon ruling over Israel, or Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar ruling over the world, and that's a strong frame because there is a comprehensive life into which you can invite a woman. And for Solomon, 1,000 women. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and it's exactly related to what you were talking about as well. Is the masculine frame is built through the pursuit of what you're calling status and how you fulfill essentially your vocation as a man.
Right.
And so, and now at the root of that might be what Mark was saying about acting on your own desires, but there's a practical part to that has to be there as well in order for a relationship to flourish.
Yeah, well,
This is
certainly.
this is why you can't have a happy marriage and just be a guy who plays video games and watches TV all day, because you have built no frame into which you could invite anyone.
Yeah. No, that's true. So you're using frame in maybe a bigger sense into which a woman can be like brought into.
Right.
And so yeah, so I think the first part where you're talking about more of a psychological frame, like a psychological framework where a man is focusing on his goals, and his goals and values are the things that determine whether or not he feels okay or not. And that's, I find that extremely practical, where you're talking, because you can coach someone, you can talk about the way they're interacting with other people, and you can see very clearly, I was in a good mood, but I went into work and my boss yelled at me, so now I'm bad. Now there's something wrong with me. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I'm a bad person and I'm not okay. It's like, well, okay, where does that fit in your frame? Were you given new information about your actual performance in which you're like, okay, my status on this thing that I care about isn't as high as I thought, and I'm gonna have to work harder? Or was your boss in a bad mood, right? In which case that is almost no relevance to your frame whatsoever. And it only matters insofar as, well, if I'm in a situation where my boss is in a bad mood, am I holding up in the midst of that in a way I'm proud of? Other than that, that it's seeing all of these things in terms of your frame, rather than what we would say is being sucked into your boss's frame, living in his world, his emotional world, which doesn't serve you. He's a good guy.
So maybe what we've come to, and this is helpful conversation, is that maybe what we need to talk about is like psychological frame and relational frame. So the psychological frame is kind of what you're describing, and the relational frame is the way that plays out in your life to a degree that you could invite someone into that life and provide containment essentially within that frame. So there's a relational dimension to the notion of frame and the psychological dimension. So I was saying frame is the story a man tells with his life, but what you're pointing out is it's also the way he reads the story of his life.
Yeah, that's the way he feels about it, the way he interprets it, and then you would say, and then acts on it to actually build something in the world.
Right. And that's an extension of that frame. Okay, look, we got that settled. We've added something new and important to this whole dialogue. All right, so let's talk.
It's fascinating, by the way, Dean, just so you know, frame, I believe, originally was and still is a ballroom dancing term. And like that's where and they're talking specifically about the way that a man will carry himself and like physically hold himself up such that she can have that containment in that frame, and that she sort of has her own frame too, and there's like the interaction of the frames, one within the other. Anyway, it's cool that origin.
Yeah, I think what we are trying to say that gets missed a lot, both in dialogue on Twitter and in dialogue in the broader culture, is that there is an interactivity in these relationships that has to be there in order for them to flourish. And it can never be just about domination or exploitation, because if that's the case, then the whole thing isn't working.
Well, fundamentally, And this really matters with sexuality. That's why it's a great thing to zero in on. Is what you're wanting is not just her. People talk, particularly in these like internet dead bedroom sort of
Mhm.
complaints, is like, oh, she just lays there like a starfish, right?
Right.
And it's like, well, I guess, is that submissive in that sense? Well, it's dead, right? It's not. What I want is someone deeply engaged in me, more like a dance, where she's being contained by the way I'm leading her, but that she is also fully engaged, and her agency is playing off of mine and feeding into it and bracing against it and all that other stuff. And
There's a
so,
big difference. There's a big
yeah,
difference between submission and resignation.
yeah. I
Right?
mean,
A
I don't
woman can
love
just
the term
resign to whatever.
submission, to be honest.
What's that?
I don't love the term submission because
Mhm.
like often it, I mean, it's in the Bible,
It's
so
loaded.
but it's very loaded, and you think of like, a dog, putting a submission hold on another dog and
Mm. Right.
everything else. But
Well, we
what we're really thinking about is being so keyed into following the lead of something else, bracing
right.
against it, flourishing in it, relaxing into it.
Yes, and but the point is that what you're describing, whether you want to call it submission or something else, is very different from a woman who just thinks I have no power. It's nothing can be improved, so I'll just resign myself to whatever happens. That's a
Uh,
different thing.
uh.
So let's talk brass tacks a little bit here. Man comes to you and he's got what kind of problems do you hear from guys?
Oh, I hear a lot. I mean, there's a lot of problems where it's just like sex has really dwindled. There's not much of it. But just as often I hear, we have sex fairly frequently and I hate it. It's just,
Mm,
it almost makes me feel worse because you're actually engaged in that intimate act. And it's just reinforcing the fact that you don't actually have the connection with her, and you're not able to just let your desire out either. It's just reinforcing that you don't have what you want. And then, there are guys who feel like their wives are just not receptive to them at all. If they try to lead, if they try to suggest something or do anything, it's just immediately disregarded.
mm.
Um, there's there's a whole gamut of problems, and they're all very recognizable.
And is there something that's at the core of all of them?
Um, I mean, frame is not a bad a bad
Core.
place to put it,
Mm,
where basically men not understanding how to lead themselves, and by doing so, building that frame that she wants to be a part of, that she wants to fold into. And um, what I get a lot of, and it's almost funny because it's hard to convince a lot of men of this, that they often assume, well, I can do whatever I want, but actually my wife is the problem, right?
mm,
She's the one whose desire is just sort of dried up on the vine. And they don't believe that it's actually a response to them. But it's amazing when they try it. It's amazing when they try it, and all of a sudden, this thing that was just lying dormant in her comes alive. And it's very, very cool to see.
mhm. So brass tacks, what do you tell them to do?
Um, well, the first thing is to assume that the buck stops with you. Okay, assume that the focus is entirely on you, and then I one of the first things one of the first assignments that I give them is to take their wife on a date. But the date is a little different than maybe you'd done before, because what you want to do is say, honey, um, are you doing anything a week from Friday? I'd like to take you out. And oh, your calendar's clear. Okay, where are we going? Oh, it'll be a surprise. Don't want to spoil it, but wear a summer dress. You tell her how to dress. Um, and then you don't tell her anything else. And then you've planned something, and it's something that you like. It's not you being a martyr doing something that you're going to hate. It's something that you like, that you want to bring her into. And then the way you walk down the street, you walk on the side of side of the traffic. If there's some guy that's coming that's a little threatening, just give her a reassuring tight squeeze on the waist and hold your shoulders up. And it's the whole way you want to operate in the entire evening is the frame of a generous host. And it's like, if you do all of that, then how does she respond? Does she hate it? And so it's basically, you're not saying, now I'm going to do this date differently, honey, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to be a leader. No, no, no. This is, you're not negotiating with that part of her. You're negotiating with her deep gut here. And you want to see how she likes that kind of leadership. So that's where it starts. And then we go deep. We talk about archetypes of masculinity. Okay, where are you as a man, where do you need to level up? Then we talk specifically about family leadership, how you can level up in leadership. And then we talk about feminine sexuality. How do you approach her body agenda competently, sort of a coaxing back and forth, the sort of things that like build up the slow burn of desire in a woman. And then the biggest thing is we really go deep down. If a man is like trying to do all this, but he feels fake because he's sort of pushing down his desires that he doesn't know how to deal with, we sort of go through and we redeem those desires that may be sinful and find the good in them and give him sort of a vision for, as Mark Kwepa puts it, making love to life, his sort of manifesto for giving all he's got in all of his areas of life, feeling about non-sexual parts of his life the same way he wants to feel about the best possible sex. And it's just perfectly congruent. And then finally, we end just like focusing on what do we do about her wounds? How do we engage with them sympathetically in a way that we're not just being a whipping boy about everything, but we hold ourselves up well and are actually able to receive her wherever she is.
Tell people how they can find you.
Oh yeah, well, I'm just on the good old X platform, formerly known as Twitter, and still known. And
your handle now is what?
Giff Lasta.
Okay.
GIFF
Change that not long.
STA. And you can just shoot me a DM. I mean, the pinned tweet I have on this is the thread is all on this topic. And I mentioned, just hit me in the DMs. We actually have a new cohort starting at August 11th. We're going to have a group of guys go through this, sort of workshop it together. And I don't know, I'm just amazed at seeing when you take men. I'll say this. One of the most gratifying things I've heard is my wife coming to me, and she was all skeptical of this for a while, but now she says, I wish my friend so-and-so's husband would take your course because it would change her life. And well, that feels good. That is very validating.
Raises your status according to your goals.
Well, absolutely. But to be able to see her, it's like, I want this for her. So this is not just good for him. This is good for her if he's like this.
Right. All right. Thank you very much. Let's do it again.
Absolutely, Dean. Pleasure.